I'm Amy. I'm a reporter at Sifted. For those of you who don't know Sifted, we're a media site that covers startups and tech across Europe. So if you're not already following us, please sign up to my newsletter. And that's me done. I'd like to introduce Jessica Livingston, who is one of the co-founders of Y Combinator, which is like the Harvard of startup land, I like to think. Jess, quickly introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about how you came to start YC and what you're up to now.
Okay, I'm Jessica. I'm one of the co-founders of Y Combinator. We were actually the first accelerator. We started it back in 2005, before there was even a word for it. And I started it with my now husband, Paul Graham, and two of our other friends who were programmers on a whim, basically. We lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I was working at an investment bank, and Paul had had a successful startup in the past, and we sort of started talking a lot about founders, how hard it was to get started, because you were looking for funding, and there was no one to give you funding back then, small amounts, because we all know to get started, you don't need that much money, you just need enough to pay your rent and be able to program. So we tried this experiment, and we said, let's give founders a very small amount of money. They'll come move to Cambridge for 3 months. We'll work with them and sort of teach them about the business elements of starting a startup. And then at the end, we'll introduce them to investors who will write checks for them, and hopefully it will be helpful to them, because no one's ready for VC funding at that point. So we did this total experiment. We put up an application, and from the very beginning, we wanted to make it really easy for people to just simply apply to us. You didn't have to have any connections or know, anyone in the financial world or startup world. You could just apply answering these 20 questions. Most people didn't have anything more than an idea. We funded 8 startups, again, back in 2005, and if there were any of you in the startup world in 2005, you'd know that there was really not that much useful information for founders back then online. This is before blogs, certainly before Twitter. There just wasn't much information out there. So there's nothing, you kind of didn't know where to get started. So we funded 8 people. We had no idea what we were doing, really. We did some novel things at the time, which now don't seem very novel, but we had a law firm draw up template paperwork to just fill in information and incorporate your company. We made decisions that day. This was incredibly novel at the time. We interviewed people for half an hour and told them that day, yes or no, if we would fund them. And we wrote them a check right away with very standardized, straightforward paperwork. And to be honest, even though we started very small, we haven't changed that much over the years. We've expanded and gotten much bigger, and now the class size can be 200 startups at once. We do it twice a year, in the summer and the winter, so I encourage anyone to apply. There's always another train leaving the station every 6 months. But that's sort of how we got started, and when we did, we had no idea, just so everyone knows, we had no idea if this idea would work.
So now I'd say YC is a pretty wild success, but one area that it's not as successful as apparently Station F is the number of female founders who apply and get in. Why is that? Why?
That's a good question. I was really excited to see 45% up there, because our numbers have never been that high. I don't know the answer, because when we first got started, and it was really just Paul and me full time, desperate to make this thing work, we weren't interested or focused on diversity. We just wanted anyone to apply. And it wasn't until we grew the team and hired someone who was in charge of outreach that we really started making a concerted effort, like in 2013, to just share the Y Combinator's principles and everything with women and say, this is an option for you. Our numbers are more in the sort of 25 to 30% women in each program. It changes from session to session. That is absolutely sort of in line with the percentage of women who apply. So it's not like we're getting 50% applicants women and only funding 25%. It's usually very consistent. We do now do a lot of different outreach. Right now, as we speak, some of my colleagues are at the Grace Hopper Conference going on this week in Florida. We do a female founders conference every year, which is actually all women. Sort of very selfish thing for me to do. I wanted an event to be only women because that never happens in Silicon Valley. We do office hours. We have a blog where we showcase a lot of the women we funded. And actually, now we have some women who have had some pretty exciting exits. For me, I feel like there's so many ways to solve this problem, but for me, I think one of the most important things to do is to have role models of like super successful women who've started startups, and we now have a few within Y Combinator, which is exciting. But I don't have a good answer.
Do you think there's anything about that? I mean, you said the funnel basically is the same as the makeup of the. Are there any initiatives you've seen in the US or in Europe, anywhere that you think are really changing? It seems like the problem you're saying is therefore why more women don't want to start businesses in the first place.
Yeah. That's such a great question. The one thing that I would be very optimistic about is code.org, which is a nonprofit that goes into schools and teaches coding, in grammar school, and young children, girls and boys, how to code. And I feel like time will tell, because obviously these young kids aren't old enough to start a startup, but I feel like the more young women can learn to program at an earlier age, I think that's going to increase the numbers.
Why is coding important?
Coding is important, in my opinion, because you can build your first prototype. You don't have to outsource it. At Y Combinator, we try to fund people who are building something for themselves, solving their own problem, if you will. I think that's where a lot of successful founders come from. And if you can't sort of build the first minimum viable product, you're either going to have to outsource that to someone, and the product's not as good because it's not in your head. And so I really think unless you have a strong co-founder who can program and build it and share your exact vision, you're at a slight disadvantage. Now, obviously, there are a lot of women who have started very successful startups that can't program. But I just think that the more we get young girls to learn to program and be excited about it, I think we're going to see the numbers increase.
And you've recently started a new initiative to do this. Tell us about that.
Well, this is very experimental. But this summer, I launched a program called the Summer Founders Program. I'm sorry. Oh gosh, that was such a slip up. The Summer Hackers Program. Our first Y Combinator batch was called the Summer Founders Program, so I always confuse them. It's called the Summer Hackers Program. And it was kind of a 3.5-month program where I gave a stipend. I provided a stipend for 40 women who all participated in Lambda's school for last summer, where they learned to code. And it's an incredibly intense course. 8 hours a day. It's really challenging. Just to teach women who wanted to learn to code and never thought they could or didn't have the time to be able to do that. And I don't have a whole lot of feedback yet because that's on my October sort of list of projects, because some of the women continued on in the Lambda course and it's still going on and they're learning to program even more. But so far it seemed very successful. Only one woman dropped out. All of them have learned to program. Some of them have told me it's changed their lives. They never thought that they'd be able to get a job in tech, doing programming, and it's given them a whole new sense of confidence, and they have startup ideas, and they're going to build their first product, and we'll see. I'll report back later. I'm going to do
good.
a
Have
post.
they all been strongly encouraged to apply to YC?
No, because I sort of thought, I will. If they reached out and said, I'm starting a startup, then of course I will. But I sort of thought it would still be a win, even if they didn't apply to Y Combinator, even if they got a job in tech. That's like one more woman in the tech workforce, making it better. So I thought that was sort of a win. So no low pressure on the starting a startup and applying to YC front.
You mentioned that your Female Founders Conference is all women.
Yes.
Why? Do you think, I wonder sometimes whether female only, whether it's conferences or communities or whatever, are they the perfect solution, or do they kind of have problems in and of themselves because there's also some exclusion going on?
Yeah. I think, like I said before, I think there's so many different ways to help support women in tech, and I don't know if there's one perfect solution. The reason I chose to do an all-women's conference, and I had like male partners at YC saying, "Can I come? Can I come?" And I was like, "No, you are not allowed. It's all women." And it was more just because it was really fun to be in a room with only women who are all focused on building their companies. It just sort of had a special vibe. Now we posted all the talks online, which, by the way, the talks would be super valuable to men too. It's not just specific to women. So we posted them online so anyone could see it. But the point was, in this room with 500 women, it just felt very different, and I liked it. And so there was no real strategy, and if we had some male speakers, I'm sure it would be, or attendees, I'm sure it would be great. I mean, we do a very similar event, or we used to, called Startup School, and that was always great, and that was co-ed, and I think it was very useful. So I don't know if there's a right or wrong, really.
And I read quite a lot about the early days of YC, and something that seems to come through is that this sense of community, and not community in the way that a lot of co-working spaces claim they have a community, especially ones in London, and they don't have a community. But somewhere where people really felt like it was a family, and a lot of that seems to be attributed to you. How did you do that? How can people who want to create that in this room do that?
Remember, it was a really long time ago, 2005, so there wasn't a lot of other communities, and we started very small. So it was very intimate. I mean, we ate dinner with these people, with all the founders, in a long table every Tuesday night. Now, just in case you don't know, at Y Combinator, we're not a co-working space. So unlike Station F, people weren't coming into our office and working. They had their own apartments, working out of their own apartments, but once a week we'd bring them together for this dinner and have a guest speaker. And then we'd do, very ad hoc office hours with them. We'd just meet them in our office for meetings. So when we started the community, it was like, 25 people, and then it grew to 40 people, and then 80, and then 100. And all of these people, whether their startup failed or was successful or somewhere in the middle, they all brought something to the community. I mean, they were all there, especially early on. There were no phonies there who wanted to play at the startup game. They were all people who really wanted to start a startup and turned down going to graduate school in order to start a startup. And they all brought something to the table, and they all had unique knowledge, whether it was about an industry or a certain kind of programming language or whatever. And we always had, they'd all help one another. And the way people kept in touch from batch to batch, if they hadn't met, was back then we used Google Groups. There was no Slack, nothing like that. So we had a Google Groups list for each batch, and then we had a massive one for all the alumni that just kept growing and growing every 6 months. And this list was so fabulous and so active, and people, anytime they had a problem or needed an introduction or wanted to meet an investor, hey, does anyone know this investor from such and such? I mean, everyone just pitched in, and there were very few questions that someone on the list didn't know. Now, fast forward to today, where there are thousands of founders, and even if their company has ceased to exist, they're still part of the community. And we have software now. We have a whole forum where you have your photo and your profile and what startup you were with, and a whole forum for questions and posting things, or I know this great job candidate if anyone's looking. I can't even tell you what goes on this forum. And because it just started out small and grew slowly and slowly. It was always a very sort of respectful place, a helpful place. You couldn't ask a question that was too dumb. No one would make fun of you or anything. I think it just sort of, that trust has extended.
Has it scaled well? Or are there some downsides of having so many people part of that community?
I think it's scaled well. I suppose the only downside is that I'd be more reluctant to share anything that I wouldn't want to appear in the press. You never know. You
never know if there's a sneaky journalist lurking in there.
No, it was funny because one of our alumni was the editor of TechCrunch a few years later. We always struggled. We're like, gosh, what should we do? The editor of TechCrunch is on our confidential mailing list here. But I think that's just a small downside to anything that gets too big. There's always going to be stuff like that. And I think for the most part, it's only gotten better, because when I say there is an expert in everything, there is. There are people who have had cancer diagnoses, and they posted, I'm suffering from this, can anyone help me, with a doctor? And people have come to that person's rescue. It's incredible, the help and support that's on this forum. And I think community, that's really what it is. Whatever type of community it is, it's all about supporting each other.
And in terms of, on the question of funding, which I know is another one of Roxanne's key points, you've funded a lot of startups. You've seen a lot of very promising startups, and maybe some of them have not quite made it all the way. What are some of the biggest problems to watch out for people in this room who are super early stage in the next few years? What things do they really need to keep an eye on?
Where do I start? I have seen a lot, having funded now more than 2,500 startups. There are so many different types of gotchas. But if I had to think of some themes for early stage startups, one theme would be that has to do with fundraising, and that is to not spend your money too fast. Because when you're very early stage, this is what we see at Y Combinator at least. They come through Y Combinator, and then they can usually pretty successfully, most of them can raise funding after demo day, whether it's $500,000 to $2 million or whatever. They can raise enough to keep going. And that seems pretty easy, and people just write checks pretty freely at that stage. Then what happens when you're a few years into things, the expectations go up on the part of investors. And it's not like, I think I wrote about this once, founders think it's like going back to the ATM machine to get more funding, and it is not. And if you don't have good growth statistics, and you don't show that you've executed well and grown your users, no one's going to give you funding. And then, the whole funding conversation could be a whole conference in itself. But then once people say no, then no one's interested, and it's this horrible cycle. So what we tell founders is, early on, conserve your money, and that just extends your runway. So you have more of a chance to build your product and figure out what's going wrong. The worst thing that can happen is that you use all your money and you come to this standstill and you say, well, it's not working, I have to pivot now, and you have no money to pivot. You're in big trouble. It's very hard to find funding. So conserve your money, and along those lines, keep an eye on how much money's in the bank. And if you're running low, you wouldn't believe how many people come to us and are like, we have 3 more months of money in the bank, and we're ready to start fundraising now. And we think, gosh, it's going to take you 3 months to even raise anything, and then you're in trouble. So keep an eye on it and be very smart about, when you go back out to fundraise again, that you have enough money to see you through. As you get your product further and further along and you start hiring and scaling your own company, that's where a lot of things can go wrong. You can bring on sort of not great people. You can get frustrated because the reason you started this was to build a product and spend all your time thinking about the product, and then you become a manager. And a lot of founders don't like being managers. So they can struggle with managing a team. So sort of, be honest with yourself, how good of a manager am I? And if you're not that great, get some help. there's tons of coaches, talk to people who have done it themselves, because I think you can learn to be a manager. I mean, not everyone's going to be the greatest. I'm certainly not, but you can learn how to do it. What else can go wrong? Can I say one last thing?
Yeah.
Just never lose sight of talking to your users. I think some people can drift along and not stay as in touch with their users, and then they get burned.
I think we're out of time, but one final quick question.
Oh, I have such long answers.
Any specific advice for female founders? Whether it's excellent advice that you've given in the past or you've heard someone else give?
Well, I actually feel so optimistic about female founders right now. I feel like it's a great time to be a female founder. And don't let anything or anyone hold you back. I know the press, writes about how much harder it is to be a woman, and showcases a lot of struggles, but just focus on building an amazing product and just prove everyone wrong, because I know that there's so many women who can do it, and I think that sometimes they don't have the confidence to say, I can do this. And startups are hard. I've seen a lot of men fail, I've seen a lot of women fail, and I think you just have to just keep the most determined outlook and just do it.
Great, thank you.